Welcome to Cut and Thrust, your podcast for the bloody and sometimes bizarre journey through the Middle Ages. Whether it's dark battles, questionable hygiene, or hair-raising rulers, here you'll get history as it really was, raw and unfiltered. So grab your sword, put on your helmet, and let's dive into the wild world of the past.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Better Merchant podcast. I'm Hendrik.
And I'm Carmen. Today we are talking about a topic that's close to both our hearts: medieval myths and what Hollywood doesn't tell us.
Right, because let's be honest, most of our ideas about the Middle Ages come from movies. Braveheart, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or what's that one with the jousting called again?
A Knight's Tale?
That's the one. And you always see the same thing. Two armies charging at each other, wild slaughter everywhere, blood and chaos all around.
And that's great for cinema. It looks dramatic. The camera can fly right through the middle of it. But it has very little to do with reality.
The problem is that these images stick with us. I've experienced this myself at events. People ask, why are they just standing around? When's it going to kick off?
Because they expect everyone to charge immediately. But real medieval battles were completely different. They were defined by tactical maneuvering, not blind rushing in.
The commanders tried to maneuver the enemy into a blind, disadvantageous
position. We know this from reenactment too. If you break formation, you've lost.
And the defensive stance was enormously important. An intact shield wall in a good position was extremely hard to break through. Pure frontal assaults often got nowhere. Usually it took exhaustion or flanking maneuvers.
Hastings in 1066 is the perfect example. The Anglo-Saxons on Senlac Hill, shields tightly overlapping, spears pointing forward. The line held for almost the entire day, with some retreats and reformations. It only collapsed when Harold fell in the afternoon.
The entire day! And the Normans tried everything. Archers, infantry, cavalry. The shield wall stood like a fortress.
What happened next is telling. The Normans pulled back. The first retreat was probably genuine, triggered by rumors that William had fallen. But then he deliberately repeated it as a tactic. The Anglo-Saxons thought, they're fleeing, and chased after them.
And that was exactly the mistake. As soon as they left the protection of their formation, they were picked off one by the Norman cavalry.
That's the key point. A great many casualties often didn't occur in the actual fighting, but during the pursuit. The real killing only began when one side fled.
Crécy in 1346 shows the same thing. The English stood defensively on a hill, longbowmen on the flanks. The French knights rode through mud and hails of arrows in their heavy armor.
And were largely decimated by arrows before they even got within striking distance. Only a few reached the English lines. The French had massive numerical superiority, at least 2-1. It didn't help them at all.
Because tactics mattered more than numbers. That's something films never show. This patience, this waiting for the right moment.
Because it doesn't look exciting. Two armies staring at each other doesn't work as a movie scene.
But that was often the reality. Commanders maneuvered for days, trying to get the better position. Sometimes battles never happened at all, because neither side wanted to attack.
What I find fascinating, we see this in reenactment too. Once you've stood in a shield wall, you know how solid it is. Nobody wants to be the first one to run into that.
Because you know what happens. The front rows get skewered. So you wait, try to find gaps, wear down the enemy.
And the weapons were designed for this. Long spears for distance, shield bosses for shoving. It was a system, not a brawl.
That brings us to an interesting point. The reasons for wars were also not what movies show. No villain attacking out of pure evil.
But concrete interests, succession disputes, territorial claims, rulers who wanted to secure their power base.
And who rewarded their fighters with land ownership. It was an economic system. War as an investment, you could say.
That also explains why they took prisoners instead of killing everyone. Ransom was more lucrative.
Pragmatism over fanaticism. Medieval people weren't any less intelligent than us. They just had different means.
And that's what makes the era so fascinating. Behind the clichés are real innovations, real tactics. People who worked with what they had. This pragmatism we see in the reasons for war is also directly reflected in the fighters' equipment.
That's a good transition, because when it comes to armor, some of the wildest movie myths persist.
Absolutely. And there's one particular myth that just won't die.
I think I know exactly which one you mean.
It's about the supposed immobility of knights, isn't it?
Exactly. The myth of the helpless knight trapped in his tin can.
Let's take a closer look at this myth. The knight who can't get up when he falls off his horse.
Oh, the classic. Knights as walking tin cans who need to be hoisted onto their horses with cranes.
That image is so persistent. And I understand why. When you see armor in the museum, it looks massive. You automatically think, that must weigh a ton.
How much does a full suit of plate armor actually weigh?
A complete plate armor from the 15th century? About 20 to 25 kilos for field armor. Tournament armor was heavier, up to 35 kilos, but that wasn't designed for hours of combat.
That's surprisingly little when you consider
how it was distributed. That's the key point. Those 20 to 25 kilos weren't sitting on your shoulders like a backpack. They were spread across your entire body. Helmet, breastplate, arm guards, leg guards. Each piece carries its share.
By comparison, a modern infantryman often carries 30 to 50 kilos, and that's mainly on their back and shoulders.
The weight distribution in good plate armor is very favorable. It sits close to the body's center of gravity and is spread across the whole body. Unlike many modern load-bearing systems that put heavy strain on shoulders and back.
And trained knights were exactly that. Trained. They practiced with this equipment their whole lives. This wasn't a weekend hobby.
The construction was also well thought out. Over a padded garment, often called an arming doublet, you wore, depending on the era, a chainmail shirt, or later just mail at weak points. Then,
the plate pieces went on top, layer by layer, and the gaps in the armor, joints for example, were protected with mail or special elements.
Knee cops, arm cops, elbow capsules. The armourers really thought things through. These weren't primitive craftsmen. These were specialists.
What always fascinates me, the development from simple chainmail to full plate was a constant reaction to improved weapons, an arms race in the Middle Ages.
And you see this most clearly with helmets. From the great helm with its typical eye slits, still relatively simply constructed, to the visored helmet with a movable visor. Centuries of optimization.
In reenactment, I mean.
Better than you'd think. I've experienced it myself. The first few times you're stiff as a board, but that's all in your head. With practice, you can run, bend down, even roll.
And the blog post mentions that trained knights could mount a horse without help, with a custom-fitted field harness of 20 to 25 kilos. That was achievable. Modern recreations also show somersaults and similar feats, although some of these stunts aren't directly documented in sources.
There are historical accounts and modern recreations showing this. The mobility was there. The myth probably comes from tournament armor, which really was heavier and more rigid.
Or from situations where knights lay exhausted on the ground, after hours of fighting in the heat, with all that exertion.
You can't get up without armor either in that state. The problem was exhaustion, not the weight. Studies have shown that energy consumption in armor is significantly higher, mainly due to heat and restricted air circulation through helmet and visor. The old myth of the helpless knight actually originated in the 19th century.
So not immobile, but more exhausting.
Exactly. And that also explains why breaks were so important. Why battles stretched over hours with rest periods.
When I think that today's soldiers sometimes carry more weight than medieval knights and often less well distributed.
People in the Middle Ages weren't stupid. They had centuries to optimize their equipment. Each generation improved what the previous one had developed.
And in the end, firearms made it all obsolete. But that's another topic.
True. Although that didn't happen overnight either. Armor was first reinforced to withstand bullets, became heavier, less mobile.
A vicious cycle. More protection meant more weight. More weight meant less mobility. Less mobility meant
you became an easier target. And at some point, the equation no longer added up.
Right, we've talked about armor and how mobile it actually was. But what about weapons? There are at least as many misconceptions there.
Oh yes. And the biggest myth is probably the sword was the weapon of the Middle Ages. The knight with his gleaming longsword.
Everyone knows that image. But historically, the sword was one of many options. Battle axes, war hammers, pole arms like pikes and halberds were at least as common.
You see this in reenactment. Many people reach for the sword first because it's so iconic. But once you've worked with a halberd or pike, you realize how effective they are.
The variety of weapons was enormous. You had pole arms, then axes, hammers.
And you still see that today. In LARP, spears are incredibly popular for the same reason. The reach is simply a huge advantage.
And it was the same historically. A foot soldier with a long pike could unhorse a rider before they even got within striking distance.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Feeling curious? Then head over to battlemerchant.com. They've got all sorts of medieval stuff, from costumes to armor and loads more. Totally worth a look.
What I'm interested in, how heavy were swords actually? In films it always looks like people are swinging 100-pound clubs.
That's another myth. An average longsword weighed between 1.2 and 1.6 kilos. That's about as much as a bottle of water.
That explains a lot. When I think of some movie scenes where swords throw sparks and the hero can barely lift the blade.
Complete nonsense. Swords were balanced precision weapons. Thanks to the leverage from the long grip, they were surprisingly easy to handle. You could make quick, precise movements.
And it had to be that way. In real combat, seconds make the difference.
The center of gravity was typically a few centimeters in front of the crossguard. Far enough forward for decent impact, but close enough for good handling. The blade wasn't tip-heavy. You could parry, thrust, cut, all in flowing movements.
In HEMA, that's Historical European Martial Arts, you can see this clearly. The techniques from historical fencing manuals only work if the weapon is light and nimble.
But here's the catch, and this is something very few people know. Swords weren't designed to cut through armor.
Oh, that's an important point.
Against an armored opponent, a sword strike was almost useless. The blade glances off, the chainmail or plate holds. So you needed different strategies.
That's why there were bludgeoning weapons, maces, warhammers. They didn't need to cut. They transferred the energy through the armor.
Right. A hammer blow to a helmet can be fatal even if the helmet holds. The shock, the concussion.
And then there were the estocs. Those were specifically designed for armored opponents.
Right, they had a very narrow, stiff blade, no cutting edge in the true sense, almost like a metal rod with a point. With that, you could thrust into the gaps in the armor. Armpit, visor, back of the knee.
That sounds brutal, but it was pragmatic. You look for the weak point and strike precisely.
The fencing manuals of the time show this too. There are techniques where you bring the opponent to the ground and then go for the armor gaps with a dagger. Not elegant, but effective.
Speaking of distance, what about ranged weapons? Bows and crossbows are often underestimated in films.
Oh, they were decisive, both in open battles and in sieges. A good longbowman could be deadly at 200 meters.
The crossbow had the advantage that training was much shorter. A longbowman needs years of training, often from childhood, because of the extreme muscle development in back and shoulders. For the crossbow, weeks to a few months is enough, because spanning aids like stirrups do the work.
That democratized the battlefield, you could say. Suddenly, even less trained fighters could be dangerous at
distance. That's also what made crossbowmen so hated by knights. They saw themselves as elite, and then some peasant comes along and pierces your expensive armor.
The weapon was so feared that the Second Lateran Council in 1139 tried to ban its use in wars between Christians. It hardly stopped anyone in practice, but it shows how feared the crossbow was.
Incredible. But let's get back to the original question. Why does the sword dominate pop culture so much?
I think it's the symbolism. The sword stands for chivalry, honor, the noble warrior. A battle axe or hammer seems cruder.
And swords are simply more visually attractive. The gleaming blade, the elegant movements. A guy swinging a warhammer around looks less heroic in a film.
Yet hammers were incredibly effective. But the narrative needs a noble knight with a noble sword.
And that's why we do episodes like this. To show that reality is at least as fascinating as the myth. Often even more so. That brings us back to the point we briefly touched on earlier. Firearms. Let's take a closer look at that, because they completely changed the battlefield.
Muzzle-loading cannons and early muskets. At first they were still, unreliable. Cumbersome to load, inaccurate.
But over time, they became more and more effective. And that triggered a domino effect that revolutionized all of warfare.
How did armorers respond to that?
At first, as mentioned, they tried to simply make the plates thicker. But that quickly led to a dead end, because it meant
more weight, less mobility, exactly the opposite of what armorers had worked on for centuries.
And here's the irony. All this development toward lighter, more mobile armor, and then firearms forced them in the opposite direction.
That's almost tragic. The perfection of armor became its end.
The armored cavalry that had dominated battlefields for so long lost their decisive advantage. When a simple soldier with a musket can shoot you off your horse,
then all that effort no longer makes sense. The costs, the years of training, the expensive equipment of a knight, against shooters who are combat ready in weeks.
And this transition period was long. It essentially spanned the entire 15th and 16th centuries until firearms finally became dominant.
In the 16th century, on some battlefields, you still had armored cavalry alongside musketeers. Old and new warfare side by side.
Armor didn't disappear overnight, but the direction was clear. The future belonged to gunpowder.
And interestingly, parts of armor have survived to this day. The cuirassier's breastplate, later bulletproof vests, police helmets.
If we sum all this up, so what impresses me most about this episode?
The most?
Yes, it's this realization that medieval people were anything but backward. They developed incredibly innovative solutions with the means of their time.
Tactical thinking, technical masterpieces, constant adaptation. The image of the Dark Ages is simply wrong.
From the shield wall to plate armor to the integration of firearms. Each generation responded to the challenges of their time, pragmatically and cleverly.
And that's perhaps the most important insight. Behind the Hollywood clichés lies a fascinating story of human ingenuity.
If you want to learn more, you'll find many more articles on historical topics on the Battle Merchant blog. You can really dive deep there.
And of course, discover the range if you want to get involved yourself. Whether reenactment, LARP, or just a passion for history.
That's it from us for today. Thank you so much for listening.
Until next time.
And so we ride towards the end of this episode. Keep your sword sharp and your mugs full. We'll catch you in the next one.